I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
Hello horror hounds, welcome to my horror house. Now, to my shame, it was only very, very recently that I realised that Takashi Miike's 1999 film Audition had been based on a novel by Ryu Murakami. As soon as I saw this in the bookshop, I snapped it up, whipped through it. Very short, very easy to get through, and wanted to share with you some of my thoughts about the book versus the film. Cards on the table right up front. I think I actually prefer the film. It's tricky because that's what I came to first, so that's what I know as Audition, and it's kind of hard to get that bias out of your head, but I'd like to try and talk you through it anyway. The film sticks very, very closely to the plot of the novel. Most of the changes are mainly cosmetic. There are a couple of specific changes at the end that I'll dip into a little bit that I think do make a difference, and the way the story is told is slightly different for both. The novel is entirely inside the main character's perspective and never shifts out of that, which causes towards the end just a slight problem, I feel, but on the whole the story is exactly the same. If you're not familiar with Audition, it concerns a character called Ayoma, who has been widowed for about 7 years, is now thinking, I think I should get back on the scene. I think I should look for another wife. But how does one find a wife now in modern Japan? And his friend, who's involved in television, comes up with this ruse to set up a fake audition, an audition process for a film that's never going to be made, so that Ayama can rifle through the applicants, select a few that he's interested in, be involved in the auditions, and essentially in secret audition for a wife. During that process, he becomes obsessed with Yamasaki Asami, who he fixates on and decides, yes, she will become my new wife, and they start dating. And for the longest time, it's like a little bit of a quirky, I wouldn't want to say rom-com, but a sort of romance, but all the warning signs are there, and it goes very, very badly wrong. This is the first time I've ever read anything by Ryu Murakami, and the thing that strikes me off the bat, which I'm actually quite a big fan of, is how sparse his prose is. That's something I'm really getting into at the moment. There's nothing florid, there's no whistles and bells, there's no purple descriptions, hardly any description at all, really. It's all very sparse, spare, nailed down. Ian Fleming is another writer that I've read who sort of employs that. What Murakami's able to do, therefore, with that sort of style of writing is really ring a bell as a reader if there's any kind of brief little description, any sort of florid language, any sort of adjective, any flurry that can really set alarm bells off. He uses it really quite clinically. There's a moment where Ayama calls Asami, and she answers the phone, and her voice is described in that moment as being thick until he identifies himself, and then all of a sudden she's light and breezy and airy, and her sing-songy voice is exactly that which sort of ensnared him and he likes. And it's just these moments where he chooses to use detail can be sort of really underlined because it's so infrequent that he uses it, except for two sequences that go really deep into description. One is the sex, and the other one right at the end, the sort of orgasmic, if you will, explosion of violence. Now the film is similar in that way, I think, if you don't mind me continuing that sort of orgasm metaphor. Takeshi Miike's film builds and builds and builds. There are some wrong things, and the wrongness continues and creeps until there is this release, a climax, if you will. I'm going to stop that metaphor now. But what Miike's film does is it shows you little bits and bobs outside our main character's sphere. It allows Asami moments of her own which warn us rather than him, specifically the scenes where you see her sat waiting by the phone in a very unfurnished apartment with a sack in the background, and when the phone rings the little smile comes across her face. We find out more details about what her life is and the sort of trail of destruction that she's led, because once she disappears in the movie, Ayama is a little bit more proactive. He goes on a little bit of a detective hunt, and the clues that he's picked up from what she has said about her life before she met him, he follows, and through that investigation, that's when we find out about her. Ayama in the novel is much more pathetic than that. He becomes obsessed with her like a teenager, mopes and wallows in self-pity when she disappears. He never proactively goes out after her, bar just hanging around places that she's mentioned on the vague off chance that he's going to bump into her. The downside to that is that he's even less likable in the novel. I mean, he's absolutely repugnant in the novel, completely unself-aware. It's just a succession of people saying to him, there's something about this girl, she seems like trouble, lots of red flags, and him going, no, you don't understand. I mean, really acting like a lovesick teenager. And Murakami does sort of weirdly capture that thrill and sort of obsessive to the point of making yourself sick obsession that teenagers have, and puts it in the body of a middle-aged man. And he does capture that feeling really well. It just means that you just loathe Oyama even more than I think you do in the film. What it also means for the book is, because he's so inactive, he's completely reactive to everything around him. What we learn about Asami in the novel are the things that she's told us about herself, which frankly, because we never leave Ayama's perspective to explore anything else, they could all be lies. And I'm completely down for having an absolutely 100% unreliable character in this, and you could be left after the ultra violence at the end with wondering, what's all this about? And that is a question that's asked at the end of the book with quite a mind-boggling answer to it. But as a reader, I was fully on board with being left with the question, well, what is all this about, and being given no answers. Unfortunately, what Murakami does, a lot like the psychiatrist at the very end of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, is right towards the end of the book, he just bungs in a few paragraphs from a completely new perspective that our main character would never have knowledge of, and says, oh yeah, Asami was like this because of this, and this, and that's why she's doing it. Oh, how I wish none of that had been explained. The explanations are a little bit more elliptical in Miike's movie, I feel. I feel they're also earned, because Oyama goes on this sort of detective trail and picks up clues, and we're left to sort of piece them together and say, well, is this the reason Asami is how she is, or is it not? Is it something else? Is she sort of a feminist, avenging figure, which is quite a valid way to read Miike's film. Not so much, I think, in Murakami's novel, which leads us to the torture and violence at the end of both stories. Again, they're both very, very similar, but a couple of key differences, I think, in approach. Now, clearly, this is the brainchild of Murakami. It all flows from his imagination, so you have to give ultimate props to him for conceiving of this. I think what Murakami does with it is just zhuzhes it up. He's allowed, through the language of cinema, to just make it a little bit more special, a little bit more pleasing to the eye, perhaps. There's a little bit of trickery at the end of the movie. There's a fake out, wake up, it was all just a dream, and then coming back into reality and no, that was just a period of unconsciousness. Asami in the movie, her torture is sort of more prolonged. She uses those needles to drive into his chest and in his eye before she takes his foot off, and then there's a fight at the end with Shige, Ayama's son. It's much more, just like the prose is, it's much more stripped back, it's much more bare in the novel. The final 2 chapters of the novel is that torture and attempted murder scene. When we get to it, it reminds me more of how Stephen King would set up a scene or something like that. Ayama isn't completely prone and drugged and passive throughout the entire scene as he is in the movie. The feeling, he starts getting his feeling and movement back, and with the limited motion he does, he kind of fights back. He can just about reach the remote control to his stereo, so he turns the volume right up and locks that, so Asami has to go and try and turn that off and find a fuse breaker switch and things like that, all the while that he's trying to move his way into a different room to get hold of a phone, to call an outside line for help with very limited movement. It's much more of a battle, more of a face-off between the two. There is one key thing in the book which, if you're an animal lover, you have to know there is violence against the family dog in the novel, which I wasn't expecting. Could probably honestly have done without. But there's no denying it's hard-hitting, and that is what Murakami wanted. I think the criticism of Ayama and his certainly sexism, if not misogyny, is probably more explicit in the movie. It's withheld in the novel. It's left up to you as the reader to bring criticism. There's another key female figure in the novel which actually doesn't get a look in the movie, which is that of Ayama's wife, his deceased wife, and we see her as we see everything through his eyes and through the lens of his very lazy, sexist, if not misogynistic brain. And all we learn of her is this sainted, sort of benevolent memory of someone who forgives all his affairs, all his indiscretions, never blames him for them, provides a good family life for him and his son, and has meals ready. And even though it's through her family that he gets his job and all his position in life, and really a life on kind of easy streets, she is sort of, even in his mind 7 years on, when he claims to still be mourning her, he really is just mourning not having a good wife to look after him and his son. And that's kind of what he's after again. Like I say, he's an absolute scumbag, but because he's got no self-reflection, because he never reflects himself on his own behaviour, this is just how the world is to him. And because the entirety of the book is set inside his head, there's no criticism of that mindset. And it would be far too easy to read the book and think that it's not being criticised. I think it is, but you have to bring that to the table. And I think it's more explicit rather than implicit in the movie. Also, I think it's interesting that in the movie, Asama gets to do more. She gets to be more of a character rather than just the new object of Oyama's obsession. And again, he imprints all of what he wants her to be on her, even though everyone around her is saying she's not that woman. So yes, it's a very quick read. It's 198 pages long. The font isn't exactly microscopic. You can probably, I'm a slow reader, but I could whip through this in one sitting. But what I would say is, if you've already seen the film, you've probably seen a better version of this story. If you get the chance to read it, I certainly would. But the film doesn't deviate from it enough to make this such a different story that I think you should seek it out in its own right. I'm glad I've read it. I'll probably try and get around to reading more of Ryu Murakami's stuff. He's not my favourite author called Murakami, but his style of prose is something that interests me greatly. And just as a coda to this video, in my own attempts to evolve as a writer, this kind of sparse prose intrigues me greatly, and it's something personally I'm tending towards. I think there's really something to be had there. If you guys have read any other of Ryu Murakami's novels and want to recommend or give me your opinions and thoughts, or steer me away from some, please, by all means, all input is welcome. Thank you very much. Don't mind me continuing that sort of orgasm metaphor.